when the fracking revolution happened, they knew conventional oil was in trouble. They knew that. Now, what they should have done is not sold any of that oil to anyone else and kept it for the United States. What that would have done was ensured the supremacy of the United States over the rest of the world for the next century or more. Instead, they dumped it on the open market to keep their petrodollar empire going. And it bought them an extra 10 to 15 years. You idiots.
Do you prefer doctor or professor?
Don't care. Simon?
Okay.
Yeah, I've learned the hard way not to stand on ceremony.
Fair enough.
And the world that's coming, I believe, such things like what qualifications you have will become a whole lot less important.
Wait, I have to ask you to say more on that.
Okay. I've personally seen across my career the weakening of the institution of the university. Right, you look at the PhDs that were written in the 70s, and you can, like when I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s, I would go to the library and actually do like a research to see what's been done before. And I saw all the PhDs that were written 25 years beforehand, and they were amazing. Right, they had a lot less technical support. Like it was much easier for me to write a document with Word, Microsoft Office, and Excel and all that. But the substance behind what they did was of a much higher quality, almost to the point it was what we called a PhD in, say, 2002, would have been considered a master's degree in 1979. Right, and what was called an honours thesis would have been called a master's degree. Now, what we call a master's degree in 2002 would have been called a honours thesis in 1979. So standards have dropped. But I also saw that when I was lecturing, that standards were students wanted to be spoon-fed and got very, very aggressive when they weren't spoon-fed. So it got to the point where it was to actually get them to think for themselves. They wouldn't do it. They demanded that lecture notes be uploaded electronically a week beforehand, and they'd hand in complaints, and I'd face disciplinary action from the rector of the department if I didn't do it. And so undergraduate in particular, they wanted the handheld. So I started embedding mistakes into practicals, known mistakes, and if they didn't find those mistakes, then they got marked down. Sucks to be them. They thought I was a bastard. I would often start up a practical that involves something that wasn't possible. Right. For example, in comminution, where the crushing and grinding of rock. The way it's done is we do it in stages. You have a crusher which takes the big stuff and gets it down to say about that, and you have a sag mill that grinds it down that, and you have another grinding device that takes it from say 100 micron down to 20 micron, and you've got to do it in steps. And so we had this prac called Hammer That Rock, where we would drop a weight down a PVC tube onto a rock, and you'd had to keep dropping it until 100% of the rock passed 150 micron screens. Now, unfortunately, comminution doesn't work that way. You can't do it in one step. So they're there for 3 hours dropping this way. It's not working. God damn it. Why is it not working? And the answer is it's not possible. And when they work that out, they get very angry. But they never forget it. And from that point on, our relationship in the subject is established. As I'm going to drop I used to call it the turd in the punch bowl. Every now and then I'll actually, and this is what happens professionally. Things go wrong and you have to adapt on the fly, and your ability as an engineer is to deal with such situations. So I'm not doing them any favors by spoon feeding them. So yeah, anyway. Also, the world that's coming, so the institution of the university is declining. And a lot of universities now, they've gone, they're no longer about science and engineering, and they're now more about social justice. And so you've got schools like mathematics and physics are actually changing their curriculum based on social justice, and science is now weakening. So there's that side of things, and when the implications behind I'm tracking patterns in I've got about 7 or 8 fronts of macro scale patterns, and any one of them would involve a major restructure of society, but all of them together in the same 5 to 10 year window means society is about to radically change, and it's going to come apart at the seams. And it's only the strong bits are actually going to, make it through this and be building blocks for the next era. And our
Mm,
current education system, we are for decades now, we've been training workers who follow procedure. We have not been training problem solvers who can think, right? And everyone's terrified of offending someone else now, which means they don't. There's a lot of self censorship happening, and so the generation that is coming in will have to be stronger than the generation that fought World War II. And yet, look around. So I believe humanity will step up to the plate and rise to the challenge. But my goodness, it's going to be a steep learning curve.
mm.
So, but things like people with multiple degrees, like the degree of flexibility that's required is going to be extraordinary. Like the people with degrees are custom fit to operate in this world, right? But if they have to be flexible, and a lot of the stuff they actually do is based on things that are illusionary or not no longer viable, then they have to be flexible and they have to be able to problem solve on the fly. And like what is their take the average professional now and take away their computer, then ask them to actually do stuff. We become dependent on computers and the internet for all sorts of things. Even something as simple as jump in a car and drive somewhere. When I was a kid learning to drive a car, we had paper maps in what was called a Refidex, right? But now we're absolutely dependent on Google Maps on your phone to the point where you can't even follow basic instructions. So we have substantially weakened as a species socially. So I can see a situation. The future is actually going to be based on what you can do. You
Mm,
know, not what fancy letters are after your name. And
mm.
so um, a lot of the things that we think we depend upon, yeah, none of it's going to work very well. Yeah.
I feel like on that note, I can that's like the perfect note to introduce your thinking and scholarship around essentially like what broadly sort of compresses to the reality crisis, but more specifically like minerals and materials.
Mm.
I think what I've really been struck by in what I've learned from your work is just how um, faulty the so-called green transition
Oh yeah.
will be. So I want to invite you to share, if you could, maybe if we actually start with fossil fuels. I know you
Okay.
talk about 2005 being an important year in thinking about peak oil. So I think if we start with fossil fuels, where we are with fossil fuels, and then start to look at why the green transition is based on bad math.
So how would you like to roll with this? Like I've got my normal thing is to have PowerPoint slides and show
Sure.
data, or I can just talk. I get my fingers smacked. PowerPoint is not a language.
I'm
Yeah,
whatever feels
let's,
good to you. I mean, I can.
let's do a
There's a
combination.
screen share.
Yeah, let's
Cool.
do a combination. So we talk, and then I'll put the occasional thing. So how do I share? Yep, I can see that. Yep, good. All right. So how did this all start? So in 1992, I was shown a graph of oil discoveries over time, and most of oil as it was discovered in the 60s and early 70s. At the time, I had no idea what I was looking at, and though after I did a PhD in mining engineering in blasting. And as what often happens when you do a PhD, you think that's what you're going to do for the rest of your career, and you're going to do it well, and you're going to do it better than anyone else, and yeah. And so the day after the PhD is handed in, you find out that okay, we're going to do something else now. And so I started up on geometallurgy, research in geometallurgy, and that was an 8 year research program. But I also worked on comminution and grinding of rock. And in that, we were looking at the energy consumed by the grinding of rock. And in terms of mining cost, it's about 40%, between 40% and 50% of your total cost is the grinding of rock. And it's to the point where in Australia, I'm from Australia, right? And the mining industry in Australia is quite prominent compared to other countries. Um, and the grinding of rock accounts for about 7% of the energy consumption of Australia, or for electricity, not petroleum and everything, but electricity. So it, it's huge. Right, and so I'm sort of going along, and then I come across the idea of the dependency that the mining industry had, and this was back in 2008, 2009, the dependency the mining industry had on fossil fuels and energy in general, and that there were a number of technical issues that were making mining harder and harder and harder, and costs were being forced up, and so that they had no choice. They had no choice but to keep going, and so yeah. Anyway, so I started to go down the rabbit hole of the industrial vulnerability to fossil fuels, and it's and the fact that a lot of this stuff was finite. So back in 1992, I saw that most of the oil was discovered in the past, and for every barrel of oil we consume on a year-to-year basis, we're consuming three or four, and so that was a problem. So um, I started to study the phenomenon called peak oil. And when I started, it was considered a very edgy, controversial topic, like a conspiracy theory. Like, you're not wrapped too tight if you take this seriously. And so so back in the early 2000s, sensible people did not engage in that outcome. In around 2005, conventional oil plateaued, and what happened there was the war in Iraq took a lot of oil production offline, and so the Saudi Arabians were asked by the Americans to raise oil production, and they couldn't. And you can see they couldn't because the number of rigs they put online went up by 146%, but their actual production across that same year went down 4%. So they'd actually sweated they were now required to sweat their resource by putting in many more wells. And now they were asked to extract oil out of their reserves in a way that actually depleted those reserves faster than was sensible. And so the stewardship of those reserves they have not been, their full potential has not been realized because they wanted more oil quickly. Right, didn't work. So we had it was a peak in 2005, and then it sort of went along on a plateau, and then fracking took off in the tight oil sector in America, and that saved everyone. And 96% of new growth has come through the fracking sector. So the Americans are now the producers. Anyway, so I started to actually study the vulnerability to oil, and that was the first section of work. And so it became a class as we should be talking about the after oil plan. And so then that moved into the green transition. And I looked at that. So if I can just share my screen.
Please.
Okay. So what you're looking at here is the metal price in a monthly resolution back to 1960 and this is the stuff tracked by the World Bank that actually looks at the health of the industrial system. So it's aluminium, copper, tin, it's all the base metals, oil, gas, and coal, and you've got gold and silver, and also coal, and you've got your fertilizers, minerals. So what I've done is overlaid these curves, where I've indexed them to the number 100 and December 2001, which is in there. Right. And so what this does is shows the relative stability. This blowout here is actually the 1979 oil crisis. Watch this. Boom. Right. So what happened there is in 2005, January 2005, the metal price started to blow out and put the whole system under stress. The global financial crisis of 2008 is in there, that dip. And that big economic correction did nothing to resolve this issue. The volatility is still there. And this big peak at the end is COVID-19.
Mm.
So the US decouples from the gold standard there. There's the Iran oil embargo, the GFC, and there's the quantitative easing era. And this COVID-19. So a case can be made that the blowout started in the oil industry, and that's actually what the Saudi Arabians were asked to actually expand in production, and they weren't able to deliver on that, and so this is what happened. So a major economic correction didn't resolve the problems. So the change has started. It's now 19 years. Okay, this is January 2005, and here we are at the end of 2024. Right, so that's the first pattern. The second pattern I found was I overlaid world gross domestic product and oil production back to 1965. So 1965 was set at the number 100. So the period of time oil was physical work was economic value was GDP. So they overlaid perfectly. And then they separated. And at that point there is when the United States government decoupled their currency from the gold standard and became a fiat currency. So at this point, the real economy, which is physical things, separated from the fake fiat economy, where financial instruments where we can invent numbers on a screen. Right, and that's what that curve looks like now up to 2021. So, and there's like a 17-to-1 ratio, and so our whole system is well and truly over leveraged, and the rug that gets pulled out from under our feet is oil, because we are an oil-dependent nation. So more on that later. All right, the next slide this is a chart put together by Art Berman of Labyrinth Consulting. He does excellent work. You'd be a good guest if you can catch him. Right.
I'd love to have Art.
So what we've got is per capita GDP on the y-axis and per capita energy consumption in terms of kilowatt hours a person. And so we've got these clear regions. So from 1941 to 1973, we have honest accounting between energy and what we call gross domestic product. From 1974 to 2002, a fundamentally different relationship started up, and that's actually the decoupling of the gold standard. And there's a third population from around 2003 to 2019. That's the blowout level. So what I'm saying here, back we go, is that big blowout that we saw in 2005, while it was spectacular and it really sort of disrupted things, is far less significant change compared to what happened in 1971. And so the system fundamentally changed in 71 and has been trying to thermodynamically correct ever since. And all attempts to do that, we have stopped. This is world GDP, gross domestic product, up against energy consumption from 1960 to 2022. 62 years. So, and it has an R squared of 0.97, a very strong correlation. As in, world economic production is related to oil consumption, or energy consumption, the energy. This one shows total liquids consumption. Now, total liquids is, it's oil, but it's also biofuels, and now it's what we get from the natural liquid gas of refineries and what have you. And this is another one of Art Berman's graphs. And so what we're showing here is for the year 2018, what's the correlation between gross domestic product and total liquids consumption? And so there is the larger European economies. There's the United States. There's the BRICS economies. And there is the Nordic frontier, which I'm very interested in looking at. So what this says is oil in particular correlates very strongly with economic value. High energy consumption, high GDP, low energy consumption, low GDP, no exceptions. Right, so here is world liquids production in 2018. There's a to 2022. In November 2018, we saw like a localized peak, and so peak oil is now an observation, not a theory. But okay, so this is COVID, the dip there, and we're now on our way back to recovering. Let's unpack that. The blue is actually crude and condensate. That's what we call crude oil. Right, so there's our peak there, and it's going down. It looks like it's not coming back. The orange is biofuels, and the yellow is the natural gas liquid-derived gasoline, the NGLs. So what this is showing is peak oil may well have happened, in 2018, late 2018, but our total liquids consumption is now being forced from other sectors. So our concept of what's peak oil now needs to change. Right, let's look at this. This is some work by John Peach from MIT. He's retired now. This is the oil discovery graph that I saw in 1992, and it's been updated, where most of the oil, there's Saudi Arabia there, most of the oil was discovered in the 60s and 70s, and the red line is production. And the same data is put in a cumulative chart. The red is production, and the blue, so the blue is production, and the red is just cumulative discoveries. And the green is the difference between the two. So 1985 was the peak of inventory addition, and net inventory started going down from 1985. The production midpoint is 1996, as since 1996, half of all oil ever extracted and produced has been produced. So let's take this chart and put oil price under it. So this is oil price back to 1861, and I've positioned the graphs so they line up on the axis. This is actually US dollars valued in that year. Now, what's interesting, it's appropriate to adjust it for inflation. So this one goes back to 1913, and as you can sort of see, it's changed the dynamic. So the belief that the free market mechanics will resolve any shortage. As the resource becomes scarce, the price increases, creating an incentive to innovate substitutes for or demand less. So technology will step in and solve the problem. Excuse me. If this belief was applied to the oil market, it would mean that the higher oil prices will make previously unavailable deposits viable, which will encourage exploration, and more deposits will be found. Thus, oil demand would regulate oil price and facilitate more resource supply. So if this was true, then an increase in price would create an increase in oil discovery. And so if you look at these two graphs, they don't correlate at all. Most of the oil was discovered in the 60s and early 70s, and the price went nuts when the oil, the US dollar decoupled from the gold standard, and then the petrodollar agreement started up. And so the peaks look like, so there's the 1979 oil crisis. There is the 2001 financial derivatives deregulation point. There is the GFC. And there is the COVID-19 pandemic that was declared. So what I'm showing here is this fundamental belief that the world is actually based on money, and if the price goes up, we will force more resources, and the economics will be forced to keep up. That doesn't work. So so there is 1985 was the peak of net inventory gain. That's that point there, and the midpoint of production was 1996, which is that point there. None of it, none of it actually correlates. So let me stop sharing. So yeah, that's the oil story.
Boom.
So
So
the oil's in deep shit. Sorry for that. Oil's in bigger trouble than it normally is, and it's just not going to work out. Right. So then there was the question of, well, if fossil fuels are being phased out, okay, great. What might take their place?
and Simon, one quick thing for folks who might not know, because the shale boom has given the impression that we're nowhere near peak oil and that
Mhm.
the economy is still booming. Can you explain briefly why fracking and the shale boom don't amount to longer term oil futures?
Right. So fracking has saved our bacon, right? But it only saved our bacon for a short period of time. Peak oil probably would have happened sometime in the late 2000s, until, like 2005 was a localized peak. Was it the actual peak? That probably would come later. Tight oil and an evolution of the horizontal drilling into allowed fracking to actually take off. The fracking deposits are much lower quality, and they have like a 90% drop off in production 36 months after producing, whereas a normal oil well will go for decades. So they've got to constantly re-drill, and it's they call it the treadmill to hell. So the tight oil sector is within the American reserves, and they represent about 3% of what the world has. So the idea that 3% can support everyone else, that's just not going to fly. So they'll burn through that 3% very quickly, right? And once it's gone, then we fall back on conventional oil again, and that has been declining at 5 to 7% in the background. And in fact, where are we?
And when you say declining, what specifically do you mean by declining?
So, hang on, I'm sharing again. And right, this is actually what we want to have. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so this is some work by Art Berman again. As you can tell, I'm a fan. He's actually him and John Peach are the best oil analysts I've come across, in the at the moment, and so the work they do is high caliber. Anyway, Art's put together an estimate of how things are probably going to go based on the best information we got at the moment. He is predicting a peak production in 2027. That's like 3 years away. But crude and condensate never actually recovers from the peak in 2018. So liquid gas, NGL, gasoline made from NGL, will be forced to expand, and and it'll peak and decline. So this is a thing from ExxonMobil that was put out a few weeks ago. It's a global outlook to 2050. In that, there's this chart, and what they've got is from 2023 onwards is a shortfall, a fall. So the blue is what oil supply will continue with if there's no investment. The red wedge there is if they invested in existing fields, they could, bring more stuff on. The pale blue wedge I call the wedge of hope. They haven't actually found this stuff yet. And they're talking about a 70% contraction over the next 6 years, from 2023 to 2030. And they're talking about the permanent loss of 15% oil supply a year. And so that is right. So the idea that the fracking industry can actually somehow save our bacon, there comes a point when it stops. It is a bonanza. Everyone's getting rich, but it's a retirement party. It's not the foundation for the next 100 years. Right? So now in 1970, oil production in America got better and better and better, and then peaked in 1970 at its maximum, and then started to fall away. Right? But in 1970, they thought, this would go on forever. And then, yeah, so fracking's not going to save things forever. There comes a point when it will turn around. And the nature of those deposits are they won't come down slowly, they'll come down really quick. Because that's the nature of them. They're very poor quality, and they need to be forced with technology to operate. And that forcing just doesn't work after a while. So, anyway, so then there's the green transition. Right, and so, fossil fuels are going, okay. Plan B, green transition, it's all pretty standard, solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, let's go. But when I actually left Australia and came to Europe, I left the mining industry behind because of the patterns I saw in the mining industry suggested things were going to get tougher and tougher for them. But corporate leadership didn't seem to understand that, which means they're just going to keep firing people and hope that the market comes back. But So I left Australia and went to Belgium to learn industrial recycling. Things like sorting and hydromet and stuff like that. And when I was there, I found the circular economy, and I was sitting in these meetings within the European Commission, and I was listening to what they were talking about, and I heard the most flamboyant bullshit. It's just like that. It was arm waving. They would say things that were just unsupported. Now, as a card-carrying member of the Australian mining industry, a lot of what they were saying was clearly impractical. Now, because Europe doesn't do mining, they buy stuff off the market now. They don't like mining in Europe. It's tolerated in some areas, but it's considered environmentally unsound. So they'd rather buy stuff from the Chinese and lecture them about how they're so morally superior, more sustainable. Yeah. Anyway, so it became apparent that a lot of the assumptions behind European leadership were dangerously flawed and ideological. And so I made some inquiries, and I found all these roadblocks. Like they didn't want people talking about oil, for example. And it says, like, well, we're dependent on oil. Why don't we talk about that? Oh, no, 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 no. Someone else is looking at that. We want you to stand in the corner and do as you're told. Yeah, and that didn't work. I wrote an oil report then. So then I actually went through the numbers. I found a back of a napkin assessment of what they were looking at and what they were suggesting was vastly impractical. And so I then actually engaged in this study. Where is it? Okay, share. Okay, so let me know when you can see it.
I can see it, but it's like all the slides.
There we go. How's that?
It hasn't updated for me, but it probably will
Hang
if
on,
you
give
have
it
it
a
on
sec.
the main
Give it
slide.
a sec. Give it a sec. You got it?
Not quite yet, but I think it's fine.
Okay. All right. So the basic question is, will this work? Will the green transition work for everyone? And how about now? Are we working yet?
No, it's still stuck on the full, like, all the slides kind of in
All right.
tile form.
Hang on. So let's do this. I'm wearing my suspicious pants when it comes to tech.
The other thing we can do, by the way,
Yep.
is if you're able to send me the slides you reference. Okay, I see it now.
Yep. I can.
Um,
I
it-
can. I'm happy to do that. So let's do both. All right.
Great.
So the basic question is, will this work? And the real question is, how do we continue to resource this? And so the study done. There's three maps. This is one. I won't go through all of them, but the questions asked were: what were the physical tasks done across the calendar year of 2018? What was the true scope of useful work? Now, if we were to knock out fossil fuel systems, like internal combustion engines, and replace them with electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells, what was the system that could do the same useful work, distance travelled, and keep everything going? And so most of these things would require electricity, like electric vehicles need to be charged, and hydrogen fuel cells need hydrogen, so that hydrogen needs to be produced. How much extra electrical power? And it came up with 48,939.8 terawatt hours of annual production in addition to what we have now for our non-fossil fuel systems. And given an energy mix proposed by the International Energy Agency by 2050, project that into the amount of power into that mix, and then look at what each system actually did deliver in 2018, and that tells us how many extra power stations needed. The elephant in the room that I didn't see coming was wind and solar are highly variable, and they need a buffer. And so I ended up coming with 4 calculations of that buffer size. Conventional thinking believes they only need 6 hours, but
And
there is
buffer refers to the additional
right.
storage for the energy when
So
there
so
isn't wind or solar.
so wind and solar are dependent on the weather, and weather is variable, which means power production is really, really rough and spotty. It's highly variable. But the electrical power that comes out your wall our electronic equipment is based on the idea that that power is the same current, same voltage, and same frequency to the resolution of a millionth of a second. And if it is even remotely rough, like even if a very narrow efficiency peak, and then you start having computers destroyed and blackouts and brownouts and all that. So wind and solar are now the primary energy source going forward. And so they need a buffer to smooth things out. So 1.4 billion cars travel 16.2 trillion kilometers across the year. We need that amount of power. So we're talking about 800,000 new power stations of average size. Now, put this in context, in 2018, electrical power consumption was 26,652 terawatts hours, and the power plant fleet was 46,423. And that's what the energy split looks like. So this is what happens when you knock out a single coal-fired power station. How many solar panels do you need to replace it and still deliver that power? So and there's the buffer there. And so the next step was, well, now that we know how much power we need, how much metal do we get? So, all right, how many physical units are in the system? How many cars? How many batteries? What energy? What have you? How much steel, hydrogen, and ammonia would have to be produced annually? And what's the metal content of wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries? How much batteries will we need? And so we need 65 terawatt hours for the transport fleet. And that's all other studies for batteries I saw had units in gigawatt hours. Right, they'd badly underestimated the size of the transport fleet. I'm at 65 terawatt hours just for the cars. The buffer, now I looked at a series of different technologies for buffer storage, and the policymakers around Europe and governments in the world believe that it's going to be battery banks. Now, that buffer could be anywhere between 25 terawatt hours and, get this, 8,628 terawatt hours, depending on the size of the buffer. And it's closer to 8,000 than 25. So, all right. And so, what's the market share of the different chemistries? And what's the metal content of each chemistry? And sum it all together, we've got the quantity of metals needed across different metals. So then we go, well, how do we source that metal? And so, well, can recycling deliver it? Simple answer, no. Can mining, in its current, is mining production able to deliver this? It's no. The mining industry will have to expand. Can it expand quickly? That's reserves, mineral reserves. And what about mineral resources and long-range stuff? And would it help if we mined under the sea floor that we know of? And or should we consider an entirely different plan? And right, so the biggest change in all this is how big is the buffer? So this is a US, the largest system in the US. It's a power grid that services almost 100 million people, and it's got wind and solar in it. And for 2 years running, we collected information of how things went. And for 6 months of the year, solar and wind underperformed. And so not only were they low, but they were low at the worst possible times. So there's 2023, same thing. So you take this power grid and say, all right, well, this was actually if you took that capacity and said, well, we're going to deliver a 22% capacity for solar and a 24% capacity for wind, which are both very high compared to other places in the world. So, all right, how much? They went down for, they underperformed for 6 months, and they'd need 23 days in storage for solar, and they'd have to keep that for, there'll be no respite for 212 days. So the buffer is at least 23 days, and that doesn't account for the grid to recover or any really, really poor weather. So and wind, the problem with wind is you have lulls of a couple of days long, but the grid has to recover from that. But then you have like patches of bad weather, say 5 or 6 patches, only a couple of days apart, and the grid never gets to recover in time. And so that's where the 12-week answer came from. So what this basically is saying is this is the amount of metal needed for metals. Pink is the 6 hours, and that's what conventional thinking believes they only need, 5 to 7 hours. And I've got most of my calculations based on the red, 28 days. It turns out that's actually a reasonable assessment. And there was one reference that had it out at 12 weeks, 84 days. And they make their case. So, all right, that includes 1.39 billion electric vehicles, 65 terawatt hours of batteries, 29 million hydrogen fuel cells that do most of the work, 38 billion solar panels, 1.3 million wind turbines of 6.6 megawatt size, the buffer storage, excuse me, nuclear power stations that are new, more hydropower, more geothermal, more biowaste CHP. Right, and there's the mining industry as it is at the moment. So that's a lot of numbers there. Let's pull out copper. So we're just looking at copper now. So copper in 2019, I use 2019 because it's the last year before COVID. And after 2020, there's some really weird data artifacts in the data. So when we're actually looking at the system when it's stable, 2019 is the year I like to use. So 24 million tons was mined in 2019. Even if we were to go to the 6-hour buffer, that's 284 million tons. But if the real answer is between the red and the blue, so this is in terms of mining years of production, if the red is a sensible answer, this is 254 years of production at the current rate. And the problem is we need to get it done in a little over 25 years. And that's the practical answer somewhere there. And so, all right, the next question was, well, can recycling do it? So if we took, say, like 34 years of metal production and compare it. So all the copper mined from 1990 to 2023 was 520 million tons. And so all of that's been consumed, put in things, and we've thrown them away and they're on a waste dump somewhere. If we were to go out and find all that stuff and then get it back, even if we could do that, which is impractical really, but is that enough? And the answer is no. If the answer is between the red and the blue, we need something between 11.8 and 34.6 times that historical production of copper just to generate the first group, generation of technology. And all the other metals had a similar sort of, profile. What it basically means is what's not been recycled yet what's not mined yet cannot be recycled, and recycling can't deliver the amount of metals needed because there's just not the metal there. And so this is actually the amount of metal needed. So this is the same information as the log scale. So the pink is the 6-hour buffer, and then you've got the red and the blue. The real answer is between the red and the blue. And the hatched line is reported mineral reserves plus estimated mineral resources plus what resources we know of under the sea. And there's the same information in a linear scale. And so that grey, white, black column is all the metal that we know of in the system we call planet Earth. And this is, you have to remember, for the first generation of units. And in 20 years, we do it all again, which if we do get that amount of metal together, are we talking recycling? And so here's where we're at. Mining production, existing mineral reserves, resources, and recycling will not be enough to manufacture the first generation of renewable technology. And there's a black swan at the heart of our plans for the next industrial era. So, so that is the green transition. So first, fossil fuels are boned and they're leaving. Second, our next our part B, plan B, we don't have the minerals in the ground, and we haven't thought through some of the aspects of using these systems. And I believe even if we were able to do that, we would find that a lot of those systems are not strong enough to replace fossil fuels. And so we need to fundamentally start all again and go back to the drawing board.
You've talked about this idea of material intelligence, and I feel like that really applies here because and the way you're presenting this also is focusing on the economic challenges, but it's also like mining is terrible for the environment. It's terrible for the land. And so massive expansions in mining or mining the seafloor, those probably have knock-on systems
Very much.
effects.
Yeah, it's a dumb idea, but the Japanese are doing it already, and the Chinese are doing it already. But it's not it. It's going to the from a systems point of view, the ecological disasters that are unfolding are extraordinary. Sea life is already in a system of extreme stress.
Mm.
So mining under the sea is going to make an already difficult situation much worse. Um, but they're going to do it, but it's just not going to help. It won't actually fill the shortfall. And collectively, all of us are now going to go back to the drawing board and think of something else. And all conventional thinking not going to be good enough. And so it's no longer a step gap or an efficiency gap or bring in a new politician. None of that will work, right? So it's a fundamental rewrite of what we're looking at.
And you advise many policymakers and agencies. Like, are you noticing their receptivity to these ideas?
Advise is a
Um,
strong word. I would say I talk to them and they don't throw me out of the building. Um, in
Are they
20,
throwing you out of the building less than maybe they might have wanted to in the past? Is there any
well,
uptick?
so there's I was really surprised that when I presented this stuff in 2021, that these people didn't run screaming from the building or curl up in fetal position under their chair, and because I the level of denial that I'd encountered previously. But I think people were starting. The information was presented in a form where they could understand it and they could get their arms around it. In 2021, 2022, I talked to many governments and many different groups. In 2023, the financial groups that were to make a lot of money out of selling solar panels and wind turbines and wind and solar panel and batteries were quietly lobbying to have me removed off platforms, and they were quoting a lot of papers that said everything's fine, Michaux was wrong. And when you actually look at those papers, like one didn't look at storage at all. They just looked at wind, solar and wind and said, the resources are fine, but that's like 95% of the calculations, battery storage. And then another one said, well, the price of these things is being driven down. Therefore, resources will be found and they'll be fine. And so that doesn't reflect the physical resources that are in the ground or what's left. And so there's this ideological bent that's at the heart of all our it's at the heart of all our thinking, that is ideology, where it's not actually attached to reality at all. And since 1971, when we decoupled from the gold standard, we didn't have to engage in reality at all. If we wanted more money, we just printed more money and balanced our budget that way. And so, at a fundamental level, our policymakers decided that they didn't need this reality thing at all. But now it's starting to bite them in the backside, and they're actually having issues.
Mm.
So, anyway, so how have things gone? I've talked to a lot of people. Um, all the senior civil servants, like I talk to the US Department of Energy every now and then, they're well and truly across these issues. They understand. But all the policymakers that actually work in politics, they're drinking the Kool-Aid still. What seems to be happening is the private sector has quietly done the math, come to the same conclusions, and they are actually changing. Like Volkswagen came out and said, "Look, we've got a massive deficit, and we're having to shut down a lot of our energy, a lot of our operations in Europe now." And Ford came out and said, "Look, we're in a lot of trouble. We can't do electric vehicles anymore." So they've quietly come to the conclusion that the green transition in its current form, the being the operative word, in its current form, is not viable. Now, and so they've actually quietly gone off and made their plans accordingly. However, all the public spaces, like in government and in universities, when you talk to them, they're still banging on about lithium-ion chemistries and everything. They won't entertain the idea that there may be a problem, and you're even discouraged from even sort of discussing that there might be a problem and what might we do about it.
Mm,
And so our policymakers are still heading in a direction that is not very practical or useful.
mm,
And so they're destined to have egg on their face unless something dramatic happens.
mm. Do you see any world in which, I mean, obviously, like, in many ways, the answer is actually like very, very simple. It's like we got to slow down. We gotta let go of the growth imperative. Um, but as we get there, it's almost like there's this stages of grief for a lot of folks,
Yes.
um, and like there's still the denial. Do you think that like will there be moments where it's not possible to deny anymore? Like, I
Oh
know
yeah,
that this
yeah,
is like
yeah.
total speculation. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So I do believe that's the case. I think society is going to break into four basic paradigms based on whether people are prepared to go through those stages of human grief. And Chris Martinson's put in a sixth stage: fear and anxiety.
Mm,
Um, and so there's six stages. And I used to think in terms of we're going to hit this wall, and everyone's just going to not sure what to do. And because we've got this collective group thing happening where we are encouraged to not raise a head above the parapet, not to take risks, not to say anything that goes against the established narrative. Everyone is essentially trapped. Like all politicians I've spoken to, they're all good people, but they're trapped. There's very little change in that they can actually engage in before they're replaced, and the system just is the way it is, right? And so they all quietly know that there's a problem, or a lot of them do, but they're helpless to do anything about it until something breaks. And when something breaks, it's someone else's responsibility that they then have to respond to,
mm,
right? And so yeah, it's. I used to think in terms of we're going to hit this wall and go through the five stages, six stages of grief. What I'm now working on is the idea that, like, I used to work with the degrowth movement a lot, and I used to work with self sufficiency of a small town, and I've now actually put a piece of work together I call the purple transition. The green transition won't work, but the purple one might, right? And based on that, um, if we what's happened is the entire commodities layer of the industrial system has been misunderstood, and we've assumed it's infinite. Magic happens, and it will always be there. It's much like tech development. It's about, like, 2 to 4 years in a cycle. New stuff comes out, whereas commodities it can take 20 years to open a mine. It can take 7 or 8 years to take a deposit that's been discovered to the point where it's got a pre-feasibility study. You know, it's this stuff takes time, and so the idea that
mm,
we can just throw more money at it and increase by several thousand% in the next couple of years is ridiculous. So instead of saying the whole system's burned and it's all crashed, I've now come to the conclusion that if we put human innovation to work, but to different boundary constraints, right? So, okay, these systems won't work. We've got a certain amount of oil left. We've got a certain amount of time that we've got to, bring things to bear. All the environmental issues won't, we've got to recognise them too. Um, there are these other systems that could be brought online if we choose to work on them. Now, so as our energy sources move from one state to another, and our resources move from one state to another, like a lot of stuff, like this here is my phone. It's full of very complicated stuff. Do we need it? No. In terms of what I actually got my students to do one year is if you had to make a phone, right, and the metrics were you had to actually make a phone call from one end of Finland to the other, which is about 800-900 kilometers, and you had to send a text, an SMS text. You had to design the phone, but also all the infrastructure behind the phone. You are allowed to use the capability that's in Finland at the time in terms of industrial capability and resources that are sourced. I think we agreed on 250-kilometer radius. So I forget the exact detail. What they came back with was an old-fashioned Nokia phone. And they use like 3D printing of bioplastics to print the shell, and that they also had a very simplified circuitry design, and it was much simpler. And okay, so that's what's going to happen. We're going to simplify our technology. The value chain is going to simplify, and it's going to shorten.
Mm.
So if we use human innovation to actually sort of meet these reinvent us in terms of what do we actually need, we have this propensity to do the same. So like there was a horse and cart, and someone invented the car, which is really like a horse and cart without the horse, so people could understand that. So now we've got the internal combustion engine driven by petroleum. We want to rip that out and put an electric vehicle in its place that does exactly the same things,
Mm.
right? Where we've got to go back to the drawing board and think, well, what does society actually need? Can we do things differently? What
Mm.
if it was all different? How would we do it? And if we think in those terms, that we're going to simplify society down, we're going to change the complexity. We're going to reinvent the whole system at once, not just the final outcome, and also develop a new social contract to manage all this, then it's actually possible to navigate your way through this. Right, and so I'm now actually looking at a solution set that I'm working on with the Venus Project in Florida, in America, that can we actually look at this if society was to change and if we were to do things differently? And the answer is I think it's actually possible on a small scale. Whether it can be scaled up remains to be seen, but now we're in a solution set. Whereas before it was all, no, we're all doomed. None of it's going to work. Slash your wrist now. No. So yeah, and so if we can get out of our own way, there's all sorts of things we can do.
Mm.
It's yeah, and so and people are very confused after standing up on stage for hours, destroying the existing system, and then destroying their hopes and dreams for the future. And as I'm walking out the door, and I go, by the way, there's another way through this. What? Come back here immediately. Explain yourself. So yeah, it's
So I want to dive into the purple transition, but I just
mhm.
right before we do that, one thing in terms of thinking about mineral intelligence, or is it?
Mm.
I can't remember if it's minerals or materials intelligence
Both,
now.
both.
Both. Using the phone example, one thing that occurs to me, you're talking about copper, but of course there's many other
Mm.
critical minerals. Do you imagine there's a moment where, the cost of iPhones experiences an inflationary shock, or
Oh
like,
yeah,
yeah.
but the bottleneck's not mining; it's actually the production of metals at the smelting level, smelting and
Mm.
refining. Like an iPhone is predominantly manufactured on components that come from Southeast Asia, China in particular, right? And so it's a very fragile system that if it's actually sort of hit some fundamental shocks, it's not a case of the price going up. I think it's a case of they'll just be unavailable, as in they'll stop being delivered, and there'll be a scarcity.
Is that related to geopolitical tensions, or is that just like it's getting the
Geopolitics will be the leadership of the various countries involved. Of we're in a tough bind here. What are we going to do about it? Right, and uh, war is politics by any other means. Well, what's the quote? It's that war is linked to politics, and what we're seeing now, I think, is an extension of the world is changing at a commodity slash energy slash technology level, right? And they're all links. You can't distinguish between them, and yeah, and so I don't think it's just going to be as simple as like it's a very complex system, the most complex the world has ever seen. And the problem with complex systems is you cannot predict what's going to fail.
mm,
You and they fail in ways that don't that defy explanation. But the whole system's under strain now. And yes, geopolitics will be a thing. Like in World War II, for example, uh, why did the Japanese decide to go to war with the Americans? Well, the Americans beforehand had a naval embargo and cut off their supply of oil, and that's actually an act of war. and actually economically damage them quite a bit. So the Japanese go, you know what, let's go to war, right? And we're seeing a lot of those actions now. You know, all this monkey business in the South China Sea, right? So they say, oh, freedom of transport. Well, all goods that are going through there are made in China. So if China wanted to actually stop um, the flow of goods, that actually just wouldn't let them leave the port in China. On the other hand, 80% of the energy needs for China in terms of oil and gas come through that region from the Red Sea. Right, so the Americans putting warships there and saying, right, we're going to embargo this, what they're really doing is threatening the Chinese source of energy. They're
Mm.
not actually impacting trade at all, because the Chinese can shut the trade down any time because it's their trade. We're the customer, they're the producer, right? And so all that saber rattling will result in, well, okay, you're threatening our long-term sovereignty now. Let's go to war, and that seems to be the game that everyone's playing.
Mm.
And underneath that game is the geopolitics that are facing these challenges.
Mm. Oof. Okay. Purple transition.
Okay, purple. So, all right, let me share my screen. Share. So let me hang on. Let's wait for it to load. So this is where you saw before, right?
Correct.
Okay. So my work is now coming out in a peer-reviewed journal. The full calculation, 298 pages, all data shown. It's coming out in a special edition of the GTK journal, and this is a peer-reviewed journal, and so it's out there for everyone to look at. The outcomes of this are very similar to being smacked in the face with a dead fish for quite a lot of people, because they still have yet to get their arms around this basic problem. So fossil fuels are being phased out. The green transition faces serious resource supplies. And even if the green transition was successfully done, it would found to be difficult. So what might work? I call it the purple transition. Why purple? It's my wife's favorite color. Ah. Okay. So what are we trying to do? All right. We want electricity, and we want transport, and we want manufacture. We want reliable and consistently stable power generation in all weathers in all geographical regions, preferably in concentrated form, preferably with a low materials footprint and a long working life. And these units, when they come offline, they're designed to be recycled. Certainly not the case now. And we want a minimal waste plume. Waste, with very low environmental impact. That's the laundry list. Now, before that was insurmountable, that list, but I believe I can deliver on that list now. Right, so the driving questions, what minerals do we need? Why do we need them? And what quantities? Where do we get them from? And once we have them, how do we manage them responsibly? This is the driving question behind all this. What should our energy systems be? How should we change our industry to develop a more responsible relationship with the environment? And the conventional answers are the green transition and the circular economy. And for the last 15 years, everyone's been happy with those answers. So in response, the green transition could transform the purple transition, we'll talk about in a moment, to develop a proposed system of energy generation and transport that does not produce carbon pollution, does not need vast amounts of exotic materials. And the circular economy could evolve into the resource balanced economy. And this came out of Jacques Fresco's work in the Venus Project. This is an evolution of that. Develop a resource management system that accounts for the embodied energy of all actions and can holistically manage system limitations more effectively. So just skip past this, all the circular economy stuff. So, yep, okay. Okay, the purple transition. At its heart is a reimagined and reinvented commodity sector, where it's a system between not only the minerals, but the technology to extract the inner minerals and the energy required to extract those raw materials, and then the economics. And they're one seamless system. Based around that, there is 4 technologies. There's thorium molten salt reactors. There is combustion of iron powder, ammonia-fueled internal combustion engines, and battery chemistries that are different to lithium. Now, there's no one technology that actually can do this, right? Like save us. There's no magic bullet. But what can help us is how these systems are actually stitched together, and that's the secret sauce. So let's look at thorium first. Okay, so this is a status report from 1972 in the Oakland Ridge Nuclear Laboratory in the States. They were looking at molten salt breeder technology. And so they had a pilot unit of 7.4 megawatts, and they did a whole series of experiments. And the last run was 6,000 hours of power generation without a problem. China is aggressively looking at this technology. They have multiple systems. The first one was actually put up in 2022. It was a 2 megawatt system in the Gobi Desert, and it looks pretty small. That would fit in most people's living room, and it's now commercially selling power. All right. So what is this? So the thorium system is actually quite different. The molten salt system is quite different to normal solid fuel reactors. So you've got the fuel is in the form of a salt, like it's a fluoride salt with thorium in it, and put in a reactor, and then a uranium plug will irradiate part of that fuel with neutrons. The neutrons will convert some of the fuel from thorium to an isotope of uranium, U-233. That produces a lot of heat and more neutrons, and the heat liquefies the salt. The salt becomes liquid, and then it moves around the reactor, and you can exchange heat. And that heat is then used to turn water into steam, which turns a generator and generates electricity. Now, what's interesting is you can put clean fuel, fresh fuel in, and take out fuel that's actually disrupting the neutron economy while the reactor's running. You don't need to stop it at all. Second thing, it's already liquid, so it can't melt down. Third thing is because of a phenomenon called Doppler broadening. If the reaction gets to a temperature that's too high, it will cascade on itself and collapse and shut down. Also, if the reactor temperature gets too high, a freeze plug can melt, and the fuel can just drain out of the reactor, and it can be sort of sorted out in smaller quantities away from the reactor itself. So what is interesting is there are several things that actually prevent a Fukushima or a Chernobyl-like meltdown action. It's a fundamentally different system that is almost not nuclear. So the BRICS economies are looking at this aggressively, China in particular, but there's also a couple of operations in Europe and the United States. The one I went to see was Copenhagen. They developed a very innovative system called the Onion Core. This is their system here. That's the reactor. You've got two heat exchangers to make sure no radiation leaves the system at all. And the temperature of the reaction is moderated with heavy water to make sure that the neutron economy operates the most efficiently as possible. And that's actually the size of the full system. It comes delivered on a truck, and it's comparable to a 40-foot shipping container. So there's me standing in front of one of their test rigs. I went to the factory. They had about 20 or 30 different test rigs that were testing part of the system. That's half of the system standing behind me, and the reactor itself is in directly behind me in that unit there. And right, so this system is engineered to design 100 megawatts of thermal heat or 40 megawatts of electricity, and they're modular, so you can fit as many of them together as you want to get the system. Now, their business model is they're not going to sell the reactors; they're going to rent them, and the electricity we've sold at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, for every gram of thorium or uranium produces 24 megawatt hours of thermal energy. So a plant producing 1 gigawatt of electricity would consume 800 kilograms of thorium in salt form each year. So this group they'll be ready for commercial action in 2028, and their factory is planning to make one of these a day. So yeah, so here's the fuel. This is actually the fuel published in a Japanese research group that looked at the Fuji 3 system that they ran for a long time. Half of it is fluoride, half of it is thorium. There are other salts. You can, for example, have like a chlorine-based salt or a sodium-based salt. And you can also have like a cocktail of uranium and spent nuclear fuel, even. And yeah. So, okay, skip past this. Why solid fuel? Why liquid fuel? Yeah, okay, so I did a map where I actually looked at um, an advanced light water reactor, generation 3 plus reactor, and I looked at the AP 1400 system that is in Korea at the moment, and actually sort of looked at the amount of uranium needed on a yearly basis, and it would deliver 11.2 terawatt hours of electricity over 1 year, assuming a 91.5% availability. How much waste would that develop? And so the 36.9 tons of fuel will have 31.6 tons of waste coming out, but the whole lot has to go into storage because it's all mixed up. All right, so I did the same thing, and there it is there. So I did the same thing for thorium. And so if we were to match the same power, 11.2 terawatt hours, using the Fuji U3 MSR system that was actually published in Japan, because they were doing research, they had a 75% availability because they kept shutting it down to do experiments. There's no reason why this system couldn't match the 91% that the other system had. So for how much thorium would be needed to make the fuel, and what waste would be produced, and how much, and what isotopes. Now, while the uranium solid fuel system had like 96% waste, not used, this system is not using about 3% of its waste of fuel. So I was then able to do some comparisons to generate 1 gigawatt hour of electricity. Let's look at that. And so you've got uranium, solid fuel uranium on the left, and thorium molten salt reactors on the right. So there is mining and mineral processing. There's orders of magnitude different. The thorium system is smaller, much smaller. Spent nuclear fuel produced or reactor fuel consumed. So the thorium system is orders of magnitude smaller in footprint at all levels of the actual value chain. Now, what's interesting is spent nuclear fuel in solid fuel reactors is mostly like 96% uranium-238. And so it's very radioactive. Now, if you put that in a neutron environment, that uranium-238 will eventually transmute to uranium-233, and that's actually the fuel needed for a thorium reactor. The thing is, it takes a long time, so it's not efficient. What you could do is put a very small amount of spent nuclear fuel in with the molten salt systems, and it will eventually consume it as fuel. And because it's liquid, everything moves against everything else, and there's no shielding. So the spent nuclear fuel stockpile that's got everyone very worried now has a solution that doesn't involve storage for hundreds of thousands of years. Okay, the second technology was um, um, combustion of iron powder. Now, in manufacture, we need high temperatures, like up to 2,200 degrees. And most of our energy is actually consumed in manufacture. And if we were to knock out coal, like in China, they use a lot of coal, to make a solar panel, for example, the silicon wafer, they've got to take metallurgical grade silicon and heat it to 2,200 degrees Celsius. And yeah, and the Chinese use coal most of the time to do that. If we knocked out fossil fuels, there's no solution. They would just stop. Like, here are the tasks that we need to do. Most of the time, it's like around 16, 1700 degrees. Things like making of cement. And if we were to phase out fossil fuels, these are the non-fossil fuel systems. Only the top three are sensible. Like conventional nuclear, that's down at 300 degrees. Whereas you can use biomass, but to burn biofuels, how much biomass do you think you need to replace coal? The planet can't do that. Hydrogen you can use, but you've got to generate the hydrogen first, and that puts an enormous pressure on the power grid. And you can do electric arc in some applications, not all, and it puts stress on the system. So what I'm actually proposing here is the combustion of iron powder. Now this is iron powder that is the same as the paint industry. So it's a mature technology. We know what to do. As they oxidized or burnt, they release their chemical energy, and they've got a flame temperature of around 2,000 degrees. And so if we have that, all of a sudden, all our manufacturers back online. So 1 ton of iron powder contains 1.6 to 1.9 megawatt hours in its final oxidation state. Now, what's interesting is when we burn the powder in a furnace and we generate our temperature, it's not destroyed. Pure iron powder turns into iron oxide of what we call rust. Now we can actually strip that oxygen out, either in a hydrogen atmosphere or an electrochemical reaction, back say by a thorium reactor, and we can take that rust powder and turn it back into pure iron powder, or sponge iron, as it turns out. So this fuel's recyclable. So there's the proof of concept that they looked at. There's a group in the Netherlands called Metalot, and this is someone in the university did their PhD, and then they did a pilot unit in 2022, and now that's a 100 kilowatt system that's producing 1,960 degrees regularly, and they have actually had 5 cycles of fuel recycling, and they lost in the beginning about 3% in each cycle fuel mass, but now that's actually down to 0.3. So what's interesting is you can actually then, so to make the ton of metal, we're using about 0.6 megawatt hours for a ton, and we're getting close to 1.9 megawatt hours out. So it's got an energy return on energy invested of around 3 to 1. That should be 3 to 1. So what's now interesting is we can actually recycle that iron powder with syngas made from human sewage. Take the annual sewage of, say, 45 people, dewater it, and then dry it, put it in a thorium reactor and a pyrolysis plant, and about 35% of the mass comes out as syngas. And so that's carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And that can be used, if we combust some of that syngas with the temperature needed, to take 1.43 tons of iron powder and turn it into pure iron sponge. Yeah. So anyway, so there's a link between recycling a industrial fuel and a settlement of human beings. Okay, make batteries out of something else, not rocket science. These are the theoretical possibilities. Most of the time we're looking for zinc, fluoride, or sodium. How are we doing for time? Should I keep going?
Our time is only limited by your need to eat dinner. So
I've actually already eaten.
oh,
that's
perfect.
fine.
All right, let's carry on.
All right. So make batteries out of something else, not rocket science. There are limitations. We still need we will still need copper and nickel for a lot of these chemistries, and a lot of the chemistries themselves have practical limitations, and so there's going to be an applications to chemistry optimization there. But also, every battery system I've looked at needs copper, and copper's a problem. So there's still limitations, just less of them. Ammonia
why is
yeah?
copper a problem?
Okay, so remember the charts I showed you in the green transition that showed a big shortfall in copper. Right, so these batteries will have similar proportions of copper in them. Right, now, so if we're going to electrify everything, we're going to need a lot of copper. Now, this solution here will need far less copper, but we're having trouble delivering the amount of copper we need now, let alone increasing it. Right, so it's not like we can make the same number of batteries and we can carry on. We've got to be very frugal, and a society will have to reinvent itself and have less vehicles on the road in some form. Okay, ammonia. So ammonia is a fuel that's been considered in the shipping industry. In Copenhagen, there's a group called Maersk, and they've actually sort of testing stuff for big ships. It's a mature technology. We can store it and transport it much easier than hydrogen, which we can do in small quantities, but not in large quantities. The technology is mature. The problem is ammonia is toxic to people and living things. And it's also a gas at room temperature and pressure. So it needs to be stored under pressure. Now we know how to do all this. The problem is the burning of ammonia as an internal combustion fuel releases a whole lot of nitrogen isotopes and nitrogen oxides and all that. And there are catalytic converters that apparently manage that situation. Let's say that happens, which I've yet to see it proved. An engine that's untuned will have unburnt ammonia coming out the exhaust. And I don't know if you've run a car before, but most of the time they're untuned. So what that means is we're not going to see ammonia ICE in concentrated human populations like cities because the capacity for people to get injured is quite high. But it might be useful for ships and trains that go between cities and even aircraft in some form. So Toyota put out a concept motor, an engine that burns ammonia. Now, for reasons I just previously discussed, I don't think we're going to see this in passenger cars like they claim. But if they can actually have a robust piece of technology that small, then we can put it in a turboprop aircraft. So aviation can fly again in some
Mm.
form. So, yeah. So put it all together. Electricity generation will take all existing non-fossil fuel systems in the face of for resilience in the face of volatility, but no buffer for wind and solar. Baseload and system pressure momentum will use the existing fleet of advanced light water reactors for uranium, but they will produce spent nuclear fuel. And that brings us to the liquid fuel systems, where a decentralized heat and electrical power production will be a cocktail of thorium, uranium, and spent nuclear fuel in a molten salt. I believe over time this will become the primary generation system, and it will be in a decentralized industrial system where instead of having one big gigantic power generation unit hundreds of kilometers away, it will be every smelter will have its own power station in the car park, or every mine site will have its own power station. All right, transport, short range, what we normally associate in cities, all the stuff like passenger cars and what most people use will be a combination of electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cells, but will have sodium and fluoride battery chemistries. But we've got to expand the grid to charge those batteries. And that's something that I was talking to the Australian inquiry into this, and they hadn't thought of that, but that's what they've got to do. All their heavy vehicles should be hydrogen fuel cells because they can go further, but we've got to make the hydrogen. Now, if we can make the hydrogen without impacting the electric power grid, then we're back in business, especially if we can do it with seawater. And so it's a combination of iron powder and human sewerage and pyrolysis and thorium molten salt reactors. Long range transport, ammonia fueled ICE, that's our maritime, our aviation, and our freight rail that goes between cities. Ammonia production, but we've got to produce the hydrogen first. Now we're back to burning iron powder and seawater. There are other ways to do it, and everything. This is not the only way to do it. And is iron combustion the most sensible way to do it? There are other options. That's the one I've actually sort of got at the moment. The thing is, we've got to do it in a decentralized context, so we don't have to store large amounts of hydrogen or transport it, and we can make the ammonia directly and use it directly.
Mm.
So put it together. It looks like this. Thorium, that's electric generation for conventional demand. We're also charging an electric vehicle fleet, which is all our passenger cars. And they're all powered by sodium fluoride batteries. Combustion of iron powder is all our heavy steel manufacture stuff. It will also facilitate the production of hydrogen, which will run our hydrogen cell fleet, all our heavy vehicles. And once we've got lots of hydrogen, we can make ammonia, which will then fuel our internal combustion in a long-range transport between cities, maritime shipping. Now, the thorium reactor, through the pyrolysis of human sewage will facilitate the recycling of combustion of iron powder. So thorium MSR supports the combustion of iron powder, which in turn supports the production of ammonia. And so all of these systems actually interact together. Minerals of interest are now, mainly for thorium molten salt, is mainly stainless steel. The fuel is fluoride, stainless steel and nickel. And yes, nickel's one of the metals that could be a problem now, but we need a lot less nickel to run this system. And once the system's installed, it's got a 50-year working life with a 5-year maintenance cycle to strip out corroded parts. So we will need some lithium-7 in small quantities, thorium and fluoride. Uranium is also useful, and also trace elements of beryllium. Combustion of iron powder, that is the vast majority of stainless steel, with some brass and aluminium, but it's got a 60-year working life. Ammonia ICE has the same profile as our internal combustion engines that we've got now. What's not known is the maintenance cycle, and it's looking like they all need much more maintenance than petroleum systems. And the alternative battery chemistries, well, fluoride, sodium, zinc, chloride, they're all stuff in our industrial waste, but we'll also need copper, nickel, cobalt, and graphite in those chemistries. And the problem is they also have problems at the moment. So, and technology metals like rare earth elements are still needed, but in much less quantities than what we need for what we think going forward.
Mm.
So, in conclusion, the green transition won't work, but there are alternative solutions. The materials required are mostly free of resource constraint, mostly. The science of most technology presented is decades old is relatively mature, but these solutions still require careful planning and frugal management of energy, and the complete restructuring of society will be done in a decentralized form, whether we like it or not. So there's multiple black swans coming in, and some of them can help us if we recognize them for what they are.
Mm.
All right, so that's the purple transition.
So this kicks up a lot of questions for me, and I want to echo back, like at a very high level, what I hear from this, which is basically that this alternative way of thinking about innovation, particularly like energy and technological innovation, lets us think about what a truly, or something that's close to renewable, like a renewable framework might be. I mean, even down to the fact that you're incorporating human sewage into the mix.
Money and shit.
I mean, we know that it's a valuable resource, and we're totally wasting it. I know that there's some examples of folks, using it for water, and I know there's a lot of resistance to that. But I feel like people would be much more amenable to their waste being used for energy than their drinking water. It's just my guess. Some follow-up questions I have. I'll just sort of like kind of list them out, and then like you can kind of pick them as they sort of come to you. So one, you referenced maybe a pilot with the Venus Project in Florida. I think you called it the Venus Project.
Yep.
Wondering if that pilot is related to this work, and what you're finding there. Two is, what is the relative difference between the energy return on energy invested with what you're proposing with the purple transition versus current fossil fuel, the proportion in fossil fuels. And then also what I'm curious about is, like, obviously you're still referencing certain rare earth metals, but to a lesser extent being incorporated. Do you have any data yet on what the relative emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of, the ongoing need for mining in that form of industrialization? Like, what are those possible negative impacts that might still need addressing in this framework? So that's my chunk of follow-ups.
Yep. Okay. Well, as it turns out, I can present the Venus stuff as well.
Amazing.
How long you got?
I got as long as you got. I'm loving this.
So, all right, let's do question 2 first. So, the energy return on energy invested, like how effective are these systems? Fossil fuels is the most calorically dense fuel. Oil is the most calorically dense energy source that the world has ever seen. All right. So, all the technologies in the purple transition are a shadow of fossil fuels. They're nowhere near as effective. And as a direct consequence of that, we are going to have to radically reduce the size and complexity of the human endeavor. We've got to shrink our whole operation down in size. I'm not saying depopulation, I'm saying we've got to shrink our size. Shrink the size, shrink the complexity down, because the energy systems, as you know, they're all right. The thorium system's all right, but electricity on its own is not enough. Like our society at the moment runs on petrol, gasoline in a car driving around. Knock that out, what do we replace it with? Now, the electric vehicle systems have resource problems, right? And those resource problems are going to shrink the system down. And so the comparison is life is about to get harder even with this solution. The purple transition is a solution set that needs engineering problems worked out. The green transition system is not viable. Like a lot of the problems being diagnosed at the moment, I don't see a way around fixing a lot of them. So the whole fundamental, we've got to reassess what we're doing. And it's not that there is no solution. There are lots of solutions out there, right? And I don't think there's any one solution as such, but we've got to start working on at least one solution, and then have them overridden with others, human innovation. So in terms of energy return on energy invested, the purple transition will be less than fossil fuels substantially, and so much so that we're going to have to decentralize our whole society in ways that we're very spoiled at the moment. We order books on Amazon from the other side of the planet, and they arrive a couple of weeks later. Nah, come on, that's not possible. So, all right. So, question 3: what are the emissions in mining? I don't know. That piece of work hasn't been done. It is now possible to electrify some parts of mining, like the idea of these massive trucks having batteries in them. There is a new system that has like overhead wires, and the trucks run under that like a tram, and they download power, and they've got electric motors that are running, and they have a very small battery, and they can run for shifts if you put the proper infrastructure. So that works, and a lot of the equipment at the moment runs off electricity anyway. The trouble starts is, where do you get that electricity from? Now, mine sites are usually in the middle of nowhere. And traditionally, what we do is we put in, say, a gas power plant, and we have a pipeline of gas out to that gas power plant, and that power plant puts in electricity into the system, right? And so taking fossil fuels out of mining, I think, is going to be we're not going to be mining with solar panels and wind turbines. We might be
Is
able
that
to
what
do.
you when
Yeah.
you talk about using fossil fuels really judiciously,
Yeah.
is this kind of what you're talking about, like continuing to use fossil fuels for certain critical needs
Well,
like
we're going
this?
to have to, because it's so ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And even the thorium systems, the bottleneck there is getting permits to put the stuff on the ground, because the Nuclear Association at the moment does not like the idea of liquid fuel systems. And it's not, to me, they're technically fine, but there's a lot of money to be made out of the existing system. And so they're reluctant to, give up the golden goose.
Mm.
And so there is scale up problems with the thorium molten salt system. Yeah, sure, they'll work where we're allowed to use them. Now, if we put a thorium reactor in a mine, right, that will then run a lot of the electricities, and yes, you can now start running a lot of those things, but not all of them, right? And the manufacture of all that stuff, what are the emissions in manufacture? They say, all right, well, you now start making steel in a hydrogen atmosphere, but you've got to make the hydrogen. Where does that come from? There's a chain reaction that's got to happen here. I don't know if anyone's actually sort of done a proper analysis on that, but the mining of rare earth elements is very energy intensive, um, because usually they're trace elements. They're not rare as such. There's lots of deposits around the world in what we call rare earth elements. What is rare is the ability to smelt them into useful elements, because they're chemically very hard to get hold of, and a lot of the chemical stuff systems needed to do that, and are very expensive here in Europe, and to the point where they're not considered legal. Like we wouldn't do them.
Wow.
And so we get the Chinese to do it for us, and you know, and so a lot of the rare earth elements, for example, didn't exist, say, back as 1970, like 30, 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, whatever it is. And technology worked just fine, right? And so do we actually need rare earth elements in a simplified system? And the answer is probably not. Like a lot of the technology substitutes, we could just go back to doing things differently and just accept a reduced performance profile. So we'll say, like, well, will rare earth elements mining happen? Yeah, probably, but not like it is now. And like this phone that I held up before, the screen on it is made of gallium, right? And so you got the touch screen. Very cool. Do I need it? No. Yeah. So yeah. Uh, so and then there's question one: Venus. Now, what is Venus? So I put together the purple transition, but it became apparent to me that when I was back in Australia, I left in 2015, but for years it's been apparent to me that the architecture of the whole system has to change, right? But the building blocks have to be in place. So we need the purple transition for the building blocks, and then reorganize society around those building blocks. So the Venus project based their ideas on, Jacques Fresco was the founding member and his partner Roxanne. Um, they developed an idea that if you were to actually develop a system, a state-of-the-art human settlement, let's call it a city, and you were to optimize, and if you were to use the best science had to offer, science and engineering, the best it had to offer, but you optimized that city to the quality of life of the people in it, what would that city look like? Now, they've got a website, thevenusproject.com. So a lot of their ideas were developed 40 years ago, which predates a lot of the problems that we now have. So, okay. Um, so a lot of the existing ideas will have to evolve, but the premise behind it was genius. So I'm now thinking in terms of the Venus Project is the place, the big picture place that we can actually sort of put all the ideas together into and like what are our energy systems if we were to reinvent architecture, so reinvent building construction materials, what would that do to architecture? If we had a social system that was actually designed uh, like a city has to have a purpose, right? But beyond that purpose, how does it come together? And so there's a hierarchy of steps of when you look at industrial ecology, and most of the time, our cities are based around the idea of economic optimization to make money. That's its primary goal, and everything flows from that point. So if you actually had the metrics of, well, we want a society that that we value people's quality of life, and there's a purpose behind the city, what would that be and what would that look like? And so a plan has now come together, and I'm sort of working on that now in my after hours. But how to do that. So the Venus project is how would I use the purple transition? So if you were to actually take that out and use that, what would that look like? And if you like, I can present some of that.
I'd love that.
Okay. Brace yourself, laddie. Let me just shut down this other stuff. My computer whinges and bitches and moans about running out of memory. So, okay, where are we? All right, so the full this solution's been put together. It's quite large. We're talking about 200 slides. So what I'm going to do is just give you like a snapshot summary of bits of it.
Great.
And share, and boom. Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is actually a draft, and so it's not quite finished yet, but it's close enough for you to see what it is. I'm calling this Promethean Nexus because the Venus project is a central project, and this is just one of their side projects. Okay, so this video is a snapshot. Oops, hang on. It's still got some of the animations in it. Let me clear all animations because I'm actually preparing this to go up on YouTube. Okay, go again. Share and share. Take two. Okay. All right. So there are 17 chapters, and the first one, which is this one, it's a high-level snapshot of the full project, the underlying paradigm, what I call the Chrysopoeia Institute, and more on that later, the project management and stages, energy, biosystems, a new relationship with the environment, a new kind of society, a new social contract, the economics and viability of the project, it's a step towards the money in a society. I'm going to propose a new form of transport, what I call industrial permaculture, information management systems, a new construction material set, which will change how architecture can happen, long-range goals, and then there's the call to arms. So the vision, it goes something like this. An evolution of the Venus project powered by unorthodox but mature energy source, thorium, operated to a new resources management paradigm is proposed, with a more responsive relationship with the planetary environment and a new paradigm in social contract and how we might live. So we're going to sort of see if we can develop a system where human society, technology, and the natural world can actually live in harmony. So we will construct a technology innovation hub in an unconventional city to the purpose of developing a new energy, raw materials, and manufacture paradigm operated by a more socially mature kind of society. We will develop an agricultural methodology that merges food production with natural biosystems without using petrochemicals. The principles of permaculture and regenerative agriculture will be used to symbiotically merge food production with natural systems. Food production would then work with natural biosystems, not against them. And so we seek to develop a comprehensive plan for social reclamation for which human beings, technology, and nature can coexist in long-term sustainable state of dynamic equilibrium. Right, so here is the Venus project. This is the project originally. Jacques Fresco and Roxanne Meadows put it together, and it's been operating since actually its basic concept started back in the 50s, but it became the Venus project in the late 70s. Now the original Venus project was based around these basic ideas: layered design, holistic, parallel development, fractal scaling, all of that. And so Fresco was a genius inventor that was a true polymath. He had his fingers in everything. So here is Jacques and Roxanne. And so the project's definitely an outcome of the two of them working together. Jacques on his own wouldn't have got nearly as far as he has. So let's skip past this. So we're going to operate on three fronts simultaneously. So we're going to the industrial system, raw materials, energy. That's all my stuff. That's all the stuff I've been presenting for the last hour or so. But there's two other fronts. There is a new relationship and interaction with the planetary environment. So we need someone to do that. And once all this new technology hits the ground, there's the opportunity to develop a new society and a new social contract. And once those three things are in place, we can then move to the center and start to develop a truly sustainable human civilization post-fossil fuels. And so the whole system's about to evolve, and we need a better plan. And it's just easier to go from first principles and build a whole new system than to adjust an existing system. So go to somewhere where there's absolutely nothing and build something. And so we're going to make an innovation hub with a mandate to look at unorthodox ideas and then test some of them in physical pilot scale demonstration prototypes. So not just have the idea, but actually go and do it, and then sort of get it out there. At the heart of this city will be an innovation hub I call a research institute called the Chrysopoeia Institute. There's more on that later. We're going to develop a new harmony with the working environment, with a new relationship with the planetary environment, but applied locally. And part of that's a new perception of what the environment really is to us at the social contract scale. Food production is actually one of the things that we need to sort of look at reinventing and to merge with natural biosystems. Those biosystems, um, the word climate change, it doesn't do justice. We've got an ecological problem. The seas are acidifying, land degradation, species die off. Um, the whole idea of carbon pollution in the air is a relatively small problem compared to all this, and we need to go after this first. So study and develop ways to assist the planetary environment to rehabilitate industrial pollution and deterioration. We've got the opportunity to look at a new social governance system to reflect the idea that humanity is now in an unprecedented set of circumstances, and it's now appropriate to develop a new system that's unprecedented. Like it's not the same old. Like, and things like free market capitalism or socialism or feudalism. We've tried all that stuff before, and that's been contingent on growth. So we've got to actually sort of think of something else. And there's a phrase game called Game B, where if Game A is how we live now, Game B would be how we might do things if we actually learned all the things that we needed to learn and became genuinely wise. Education, we're going to have a settlement and everything in education will be available to everyone, but we're going to look at different styles of education. Holistic health, a new health paradigm, inform and practice. Transport. Now, we need to reinvent transport, and it comes down to trucks. Trucks are taking a vast proportion of the energy post fossil fuel, and so we're going to look at what trucks actually do. And can we do what trucks do with some other system? And the answer is yes. I can show that later. Water. So we've got multiple water systems that are in that need to be in balance with natural systems. Drinking water, grey water, black water, and then we've got all the natural biowater systems, rainwater, seawater, and they all have to be in balance. Energy. A new non-fossil fuel paradigm that allows decentralization, simplification, and contraction in size of the industrial sector. That's actually the purple transition, which we've just been through. And put it all together, an innovative architecture. There's one of the problems that we are facing is there's resource shortages around sand, and cement is very energy intensive. And so, can we replace concrete as a primary building material? And so can we look at geopolymers and extract stuff from the local environment instead? The answer is yes. And so if we were to do that, what would it look like? At the heart of everything is a vibrant community, and that will protect everything. So the vision goes something like this: a new decentralized energy system, a reimagined transportation network. We've got different design parameters of how we manage our resources. The resource balanced economy, which is an evolution of the resource based economy by adding an energy term to everything. What we call the circular economy is a systems designed for partial resource sourcing. The steady state economy can be seen as like the boundary conditions of the system design that we need to treat as asymptotes. But the resource based economy is a systems designed for operational management. So degrowth, looking at the simplification of complexity and size to a self-sustaining system. So how do we do that? Well, can we run society on a small number of components that are simplified and that are manufactured from resources sourced locally? And can we collapse that value chain into, using modern technologies like 3D printing to collapse the value chain into a single shed? And the answer is possibly for some things. Permaculture, regenerative agriculture, biomimicry, and indigenous knowledge around the world will guide us. We're going to look at money, and can we actually change what money is used for? Can we do something else instead? And so this is the start of the development of new social contract, which is Game B evolved. So these are the existing Venus project what they call the values. They have like a symbiotic balance between all of these things. So instead of actually having an extreme, have like a case-by-case synthesis of what's appropriate for each system and form, which once you actually get into it, it's actually quite useful. This is actually some artwork of what the Venus Project city might look like conceptually. Here's another one. This is a plan view. And here's another one. This is actually an overview of what the finished product might look like. And it'll house something like 10,000 people. So we want to build a gateway to a world worth leaving to our grandchildren. The harmonious merging of society, technology, and environment, where we will shorten the value chain of the industry systems and radically change the architecture of the whole industrial system, develop a new social contract where all the needs of the people in the society are met without the exploitation of anyone. Energy, the sourcing of raw materials and manufacture is reinvented to become much smaller in footprint. It's a storehouse of knowledge of all kinds and will later become a source of commerce and useful services to surrounding society. So that's Promethean Nexus. Fix bayonets and take that hill. All right, so that's the overview. And each one of those things can be unpacked into a 30 slide presentation. What do you want?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I'm really struck just thinking about the kind of the change in trucking, like thinking about, transport.
So we can fire that one up. Yep.
Let's fire it up.
Fire it up, baby. All right, so let's just... Okay. Record. Okay. So, share. I've got a reasonably good computer, but geez, it whinges about memory. Come on. All right. Let me know when you can see it.
It's loading, but you're sharing.
So, no, let me know when I start. So, has it, or should we reload?
Maybe reload it.
Okay. Trust no one. Okay. Because sometimes it just hangs and it will just, it won't. Anything yet?
Well, I mean, I can see it's like the title slide of the.
Yep. So yes, title slide. What about now?
Oh, okay, great. Not so. Yeah, I can see the title slide.
Okay. So this chapter is to look at reinventing transport. So the work done at the Geological Survey, where I actually looked at the if we were to replace the entire existing system, phase out fossil fuels and replace them with something else, what would that mean? Right. So in terms of transport, this is how it ended up being split up. The red, 42.78% of the energy was to make the hydrogen to run the semi-trailer Class 8 truck fleet. Where, okay, so that there represents about 2% of the entire transport fleet, but it's taking 43% of the energy, whereas the electric vehicles are 97.95% of the transport fleet, but are taking 26% of the energy. So there's a massive imbalance. And so instead of actually forcing the issue where we just make a new truck, I mean, it's all viable. Like there are electrical trucks that can run. It's just a question of how long for and how far. And hydrogen trucks, okay, how long for and how far, and how do we keep the supplies up? But now we've got to think about, like, do we need to do that? And what I realized was when looking at trucking information, trucking routes, they don't go everywhere all the same. There are some routes where trucks preferentially go between distribution hubs, right? So you have, for example, like 85% of trucks will travel down, say, 3 or 4 transport routes. So what if we got those transport routes and did something else? Our trucks take cargo from one place to the other. Okay. So Jacques came up with a series of ideas, like he came up with the idea of the monorail in the 50s. And this is some of his early drawings. Now, we've now got monorails. That's actually technology that's fairly well established, but it's a way of moving large amounts of people. And so we've got things like metro stations and monorail stations, and so we've got the idea of that can actually go to move people. But what about cargo? So I'm going to show you something that I saw in a mining project. So this was a concept where they wanted to move ore over an 80-kilometre stretch from the mine out to the port. And instead of building an expensive train rail, where it was, rails are really expensive because you've got to, have them level, and everything. The infrastructure is expensive. So what they have is a framework here, and an underslung um, pod is goes along on a rail, and so they have tested. This is a group called Futran. They've actually tested this in South Africa. What's in this pod is ore. So you've got like 15 tons of ore in this skip, and it will skirt along the rail out to the port. And so this was the concept. And so it's all quite sort of developed, and they put the numbers together, and it looks pretty good. And so here's the concept: they had an 80-kilometre track, and their capex cost 132 million to set up, and about 2 million a year to operate. So 1.6 kilowatt hours a kilometre for each skip is what it would cost to actually move this stuff around. And so they're the inputs and outputs. And so they've got the idea of moving a shipping container the same way, or specialised haulage. And then they thought, well, this actually runs the same way as a monorail, only but it's underslung. So you put the stuff together. So this is all the engineering that's behind it. And so you've got like a light track, a medium track, and a heavy track. And the heavy track is the one I'm interested in. So full-size shipping containers. So we can move shipping containers full of stuff around the city and around the industrial networks. And so it's got all the engineering is in place. So here's the concept. On the track, on the top, we've got monorails, a two-way monorail system to move people. Underneath those monorails, we have these underslung pods, and I call it the spine rail arterial system. And so we've got the ability to move lots of people and lots of cargo between distribution points. Now, we will have some trucks on the road, but just much less of them. We will still need the flexibility of some trucks. And if we can have a focus on communal transport as well, and so there'll be less cars as well. So the traffic on the road will be much, much, much less, but the city is now set up and designed where everything you need to do can be done along this spine rail arterial system. And it'll become a form of transport engineering designed for the arterial network throughout the city. And so let's say this is a plan view of the concept of the city. It could look like this, where each one of these red dots is a monorail loading station for people to actually sort of get on and off. And at the edge of the city, we've got a freight receiving and handling station. It's also where we actually park the trains when they're not in use. Also, for food produce, we've got the idea, and this is actually the same for materials and production. In the underslung specialised haulage system, we could be loading on and loading stuff from the agricultural belt. We could be having food produce loaded on, and we can have things like large amounts of produced compost waste being loaded off in different points around the place. So we can transport large masses very quickly if we're organised. And so there's the water, and it's all together. So it's oh yeah, and so this is actually a concept of the city where we've got. Let's do that again. My computer's having issues. So there is the conceptual thing of the city, but in a constellation on a train line around the city is all the planned pilot scale industrial stuff. Um, and so raw materials can be transported between all of these things easily on a spine rail system.
Do you imagine there would be some amount of retrofitting existing infrastructure to make or
Well,
to sort of incorporate into this?
well, you could, but the whole point of actually going out to a greenfield site where there's nothing, and you've got to build everything from scratch, what you build now becomes up for grabs.
Hmm.
Right, and so the society I'm actually proposing here is a demonstration hub that will actually show this, and we can learn things by doing it. Then other groups can go, okay, that now works. We've now got something to look at, and then they can retrofit their existing systems based on what
Hmm.
we've learned. That is a several steps beyond. This is the conceptual thing at the moment, where everything will be designed and fit for purpose, and
Got it.
nothing will be wasted. Now we got to. There's a whole lot of setup and infrastructure that has to go in upfront for that, and so that'll be so much easier than trying. You imagine sort of like operating in, say, the city of Amsterdam and going to the local authorities and say, we want to do some innovative engineering and architecture. They say, get out. It's not compliant to the code. Don't waste my time. so, I'd rather go outside the Western world and outside the BRICS economies and operate on a large piece of privately owned land and have a relationship with the local government that actually says this is what we're doing and why, and so and develop a whole lot of really unusual stuff.
Hmm.
And so, but it's not just have an idea. I've got an idea that'll change the world. Demonstrate it. Actually, demonstrate. Physically demonstrate it.
Hmm.
So, but transport's a problem. Our oil is going, and trucks run our society. And when trucks stop, Alice Friedemann wrote a book called When Trucks Stop, and a second book, Life After Fossil Fuels. And that's actually quite a good expose of the problem that we face. And so we either face these problems with some sort of innovative solution, or we go backwards and we just go back to horse and carts or steam technology as it was in 1880.
Hmm.
Can we do steam differently with modern technology? Sure, we can. And and maybe that's a solution. Or can we do something else?
Is anybody doing that to your knowledge?
Lots of people are looking at steam and steam technology, but they're not. I haven't actually seen any innovations of it,
Hmm.
and it all comes down to what fuel do you use. So what are you burning? And coal is the
Hmm.
most dense system, but they're talking about like, can we have a hydrogen fuel cell and like a hydrogen tank and actually combust that? And I said, well, you can, but when you combust hydrogen, there's not that much energy in it. You can only go so far.
Hmm.
So yeah. Uh,
Got it.
so I'm a big believer in humans will rise to the occasion. There is human innovation, right? But that phrase, someone will sort out something, is usually used to shut down the discussion. Leave me alone. Someone will sort this out. You don't. I don't want to think these scary thoughts, right? So we have to actually meet this. You can't just say someone will think of something. You've got to be out there thinking of something. Um, you've got to be the one having the idea and then give it to everyone else.
Hmm.
Otherwise, hmm. And so yeah, the future I think is going to be rough, but it's not homogenous. It's not going to be the same everywhere. Some areas will fare okay and others won't. Just site specific, localized problems. But
Hmm.
and the problem is people have become very used to the way life is at the moment. They're very comfortable, and the idea that they have to source their own food now and all the normal systems they depend on just won't work very well, and or if at all, and they don't like that. They don't want to think about that, and so it's
I mean, I don't like thinking about it.
no, but it gets you thrown out of dinner parties if you say the wrong thing.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Nate Haggins's idea around the Great Simplification, and I know you've done a number of talks with him. But just like the simplification is coming, and it's either because we'll ramp into it
Yeah.
or it will happen to us.
So
Um,
Nate's a friend of mine, and he's one of the global thought leaders, and he's absolutely correct. Um, and so simplification, that's what I'm proposing here. If we were to simplify our global industrial system, what would that look like? If we were to source energy not using fossil fuels to the point where it's useful, what would that look like? If we were to
mm,
change the relationship with our working environment to the point where we're actually in balance with those environmental systems, what would that look like? That's what I'm trying to do here. And so I'm actually, I believe that this work, if actually understood, could actually unify all tribes. As in, it could actually bring together all these people who think different things, and we can actually hit a target that they all agree on.
mm.
And so that's what gets me out of bed every morning.
I mean, I will say, the ideas you're proposing with the purple transition, and of course, I don't come from an energy and minerals mining background, but they they do fill me with hope. And I know that's a hokey word. I know it's a problematic word, and it is often used for the same reason as like, oh, somebody will figure it out. That like you need to have hope even in the
Yeah.
face of hard things. Like that's not necessarily true. But thinking about ways that we can use the current abundance
Mm.
of fossil fuels and of modern, convenient infrastructure to begin to build out,
Mm.
self-sustaining, self-reliant infrastructure that's decentralized, while still keeping some of the, convenient globalized infrastructure we have. That even though I know intellectually that that sounds incredibly difficult in so many ways,
Mm.
it gives me this glimmer of hope of like it's new forms of meaning, new forms of purpose, new ways of building community and deriving value out of life. So yeah, I really appreciate the formulation.
So what's weird is when you look at history and you think, well, what did you do with that? Like the 1950s was the golden era, right? Everything was magnificent. Everything was, you could actually have
Well,
a
economically, some folks, yeah.
economically, but also socially. What did we do with that time? Oh, we had the Cold War instead. If we didn't have a problem, let's invent one. You Muppets. Yeah, that was the golden era, and that's what you did with it. The Cold War. And then you look at like the United States, for example, when it engaged in the fracking revolution, it could have done things so differently. For example, when the fracking revolution happened, they knew conventional oil was in trouble. They knew that. Now, what they should have done is not sold any of that oil to anyone else and kept it for the United States. What that would have done was ensured the supremacy of the United States over the rest of the world for the next century or more. Instead, they dumped it on the open market to keep their petrodollar empire going. And it bought them an extra 10 to 15 years, or 15 years. You idiots. Yeah, it's there was an opportunity that they could have actually should have ensured the longevity, and the same amount of carbon gets dumped, right? But they could have ensured their own livelihood, but instead the Americans are presenting like a third world country that's tearing itself apart now. Anyway, but based on that thinking, right? Can we see what's around us now differently in that sort of paradigm, which can actually navigate ourselves out of this mess, or or at least some parts of human society can navigate out of this mess? What would that look like? The old phrase: "If all you've got is a hammer, then every problem's got to look like a nail."
Mm,
Right? What if someone invented screws and bolts then? Hmm. Um, yeah, and so ultimately, I'm an optimist, but we've got to wade through some very, very serious challenges and recognize them.
yeah.
Um, and and to be frank, we won't get out of our own way, and we are going to do this the hard way.
Mm.
So my hope is that I can do this on a small scale and then see what happens. So
Right. I mean, yeah. If it's going to happen the hard way, then the pilot the case studies become all the more important for how people respond after. Um, but yeah, you've been so generous with your time. I know we've been going for a couple hours now.
yeah,
And there's so much more that I still want to talk to you about. So I'd love to have you back sometime in the future.
sure.
But just in the interest of being fair to your time, I have 3 questions I like to close each episode with.
Mhm.
Um, so the first of those is, what's one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Situation awareness. Um, we've got such a lot of deceit and illusion around us at the moment, um, and people won't think for themselves, and they'll behave as programmed. I wish people would think critically more. Now, what's also interesting is in our current um, iteration, we've been encouraged to think in terms of there's no empathy anymore. People have become quite rude. And the American politics in particular, the different political parties are encouraged to treat each other with such venom. So no matter what happens in this election, the country is at each other's throats, and it's almost like you need a civil war to sort it out. And it didn't have to be that way. It was they were encouraged to be that way. They were socially programmed to go in that direction. It's the idea of fifth generation warfare, and so we're very tribal at the moment, and everyone's convinced they're absolutely right, and everyone else is absolutely wrong, and they should be shunned by the rest of humanity and possibly killed. Okay, what the right? And so if every human institution and every human interaction is based around the idea of love, trust, respect, and honor, then the way we are at the moment has seriously atrophied and corroded to the point where or we are now almost incapable of doing anything, which means if we don't sort ourselves out soon, then we do nothing and we accept what the natural order of things delivers. So I would respectfully ask people to think in those terms.
Mm.
Question one. Question two.
Here, here, yeah. What's one resource you would recommend or that you use for making better sense of reality?
A resource.
And you can
Books.
take that broadly.
Books. So I like reading physical books. Like what have I got here? Where is it? There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
So we are being encouraged and pushed into a digital world. Everything's been pushed online. At the same time, that digital world has become hyper controlled. In a really unfortunate way, where to do absolutely anything now, you need a password and an account, and soon you have to pay for that account, and what you pay for that account keeps going up, and it's bollocks. Learn to read, learn to write. Again, I write in a journal, and a paper-bound book. The information is solid. It's hard won because it takes time to bring it all together, and the rest of the world can be seen through a lens of books, the way it used to be. Now, in doing that, it gives you time to think, which means what you think consolidates stronger. So while I use the internet and the electronic world on a day to day basis, I think the foundation that actually will carry through on this is physical books.
I love to hear that.
Mm.
I love physical books. I will say I love reading ebooks as well, but I read
Yeah,
it on
yeah,
a Kindle Paperwhite, so it
yeah.
gets closer to the experience of a real book
Yeah,
than.
but Kindles are temporary. Like, here, where is it? Here's my Kindle. It's died. It just froze, and all the books on it are now not accessible. So I've got to buy a new Kindle and download everything again.
Oh, that's
Right?
frustrating.
No, but things that are electronic are fragile, very fragile.
Yeah. It's
and
true.
controllable.
It's
All
true.
right, question 3.
All right. What is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Right, there's been a couple of those. Um, uh, Getting run over while riding a bicycle on my way to uni, that was one.
Wow.
By a truck.
Wow. This is where your attempt to
Um,
remake trucking emerges.
Oh well, like my brakes failed, and and a truck stopped at the lights, and I skidded under the back wheels of it, and I smacked my face on the diff between the two
Oof.
back wheels. And of course, the truck driver had no idea what it was. He just drove off, and I'm just lying there going, "Oh, yes, reality interrupted." Young men need such things. It helps them along to, yes, to tell them they're not bulletproof and immortal. Uh, in all seriousness, there's a couple of things that were relevant. Around 2002, I no 2005, I read a book by Matthew Simmons about peak oil, twilight in the desert. He called it, and I was because I have a degree in applied science, physics, and geology, and so studying geology, I actually saw a map of oil discoveries. I didn't understand it at the time, being a young punk that thought he knew everything. Went in one ear and out the other, but I remembered it. And so when in 2002, which was what 7 years later, 7 or 8 years later, I think, whoa, what am I seeing? Gosh! And then I actually went to work and tried to talk to industry professionals about it in the mining industry, and the discombobulation was watching those professionals dismiss the problem out of hand using techniques that were obviously bullshit. Right? And that was the foundation for everything. And you think, hang on a sec, what am I seeing here? And this another one of note was in 2015 in Brussels, sitting in a H2020 European Commission research meeting, where they were discussing the distribution of a $99 billion project, billion with a B. 400 universities across Europe were being funded by this one project, and but then watching the foundation paradigm behind it, their strategy was just to pour an enormous amount of money on the floor and hope magic happened. And over time, there was no comprehensive plan for industrial reform. They all talked the talk, but they didn't do any work. And a lot of what was produced is based on assumptions that are just not that useful.
Mm.
And I actually saw a discontinuity. I saw things were badly out of phase. And I spent a couple of years actually thinking about how do I communicate this in a way where I don't get thrown out of the room or burned at the stake for heresy.
Mm.
Um, oh, yeah, that's another one. Getting burned at the stake for heresy, that's another one that was actually quite useful. Um,
Say more, please.
so every now and then you'll say something controversial, and the people around you says, right, mate, it's heresy. Can't have that. Right. And so you get strapped to a pole and burned at the stake. And while they're doing their worst, it occurs to you that their worst really isn't that bad. And then you become unhinged in a James Bond villain kind of way. Then you think, you know what? They can't actually stop me. That's good to know. And that actually sort of gave me the freedom to think outside the box. Humans are like a herd of horses where they absolutely are terrified of being rejected by the herd.
Mm.
Right? But once you've actually been rejected by the herd for controversial ideas, and you think, well, I didn't need you Muppets anyway then. Oh, okay. Now what? So yeah, so and that was actually perhaps more useful than everything else.
Well, I'm glad you encountered that early enough on to lead the way in terms of us being a little bit more honest about energy and material realities.
So, someone called me a baby James Bond villain once as an insult, and it was meant as an insult, but I rather like it.
Amazing. Well, that is as good a note as any to end on.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you have coming up, or anything to call attention to for folks to check out, or places people can find you?
My GTK bulletin papers are about to be published. They've been formatted, signed off. There's just a few little extra details that have. So they're about to come out, and when they do, they'll have the full calculation, full set of numbers, full reasoning, everything, and there for everyone to loot and pillage for their own works. Right.
Amazing. And I'll be sure to include those in the show notes.
Yep.
All right, Simon, thank you again so much. This has been hugely illuminating.
Cool.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.